Welcome to Pensari Basketball Live, and today we are going to be talking about the topsy-turvy, crazy road that the Indiana Pacers took to finally acquiring Pascal Siakam. This is not uncommon in the NBA. It sometimes takes a lot of people coming together in back rooms. It's not supposed to be done. The CBA and the NBA, of course, the NBA frowns upon, these backroom dealings, but agents are always in players' ears. Players are talking to other players. There's really no way to stop it. And I'm here to say that there's a lot that went into Pascal Siakam finally becoming an Indiana Pacer. And there were a lot of things that were important to Pascal Siakam in any trade. Allegedly, prior to this trade happening, there were rumors that he would not sign an extension. He would not agree to commit long-term to any team. The reporting did not come out that there was a team that he was a little more willing, a little more open to signing with long-term, and that was the Indiana Pacers. And there were a lot of extenuating circumstances and factors at play there. First, if you've been living under a rock, the Toronto Raptors did trade Pascal Siakam. In return, they got back Kyra Lewis via a separate trade with the New Orleans Pelicans, which was mainly due to trying to avoid luxury tax payments, Jordan Nwora, and Bruce Brown. In 2 games, one with Tyrese, one without Tyrese, Pascal Siakam has looked rejuvenated defensively. Certainly offensively, he's been worse. Just to take a quick look, obviously his box plus minus has been lower. You can't look at 2 games too much, but obviously I've watched both games, and Pascal Siakam does look to be really dialed in defensively. He fouled out of last night's game against the Phoenix Suns, jawing at Kevin Durant. I haven't seen this guy so actively engaged. It's good to see. Obviously, if you're a Raptor fan, you didn't want to see him go. Some Raptor fans didn't want to see him go. I certainly, I'm not one of them, but I think that it is a good thing that he has gone to a winning situation, the one that he wanted to be a part of. And I certainly want to talk a little bit more as a closing chapter, again, to provide closure to how this deal happened. First of all, very quickly, this is the 10 next games. They have Denver, Philly, Phoenix, Memphis, Boston, New York, where Pascal Siakam will be reunited with OG Anunoby. Sacramento, Charlotte. Charlotte should be hopefully an easy win for the team. Houston, where he will face off against Fred VanVleet. Golden State, a team that was also rumored to be going at him, and also New York, again at OG Anunoby. So without further ado, let's talk about the 7 or 8, I believe 8 factors which influenced Pascal Siakam going to Indiana, and why Indiana above other places. Well, in order to tell this story properly, we need to go all the way back to the draft. Pascal Siakam was not a highly touted prospect coming out of New Mexico State. He was a very productive player, but due to the fact that he played in a lesser conference, by many people's opinion, kind of projected as a role player, not a super highly touted high school player. He was late to picking basketball, so he kind of missed all the AAU hype that a lot of prospects get. And so he was overlooked by many, many front offices. 2 front offices that did not overlook Pascal Siakam. One of them was the front office that actually picked him, which is Masai Ujiri, Bobby Webster, Dan Tolzman, and everyone who was there at the time. And the other front office, ironically, that did not overlook him was the Charlotte Hornets. And who was the assistant general manager of the Charlotte Hornets at the time? His name is Chad Buchanan. And these were the 2 front offices that had showed interest to Pascal at the time as a first-round prospect. Otherwise, I'm not kidding. If the Raptors don't pick him at 27, the Hornets did pass up on him in order to trade the pick over for Marco Bellinelli at the time. If these 2 teams don't pick him, there's a very good chance that Pascal Siakam ends up sliding to pick 40, 45, which is exactly where he was mocked. So showing that early love to Pascal Siakam, a loyal guy, ever the loyalist, he did not forget it. So the fact that Chad Buchanan is now the general manager of the Indiana Pacers did go a ways to pushing this deal forward. First, a quick word from our sponsor, the Pendance Film Festival, coming up in a month, and we'll be right back with reasons 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 right after that. Word from our sponsor. The Pendance Film Festival is happening February 22nd to 25th. It is a celebration of international films. It is a brilliant film festival in its 7th season. Prior to the COVID pandemic, it was the fastest growing film festival in the world. What is my affiliation with Pendance? What are they paying me to say this? Well, I am Pendance. I'm the festival director and founder of Pendance. It is my baby. And if you love great films, if you have a film lover in your life, this is a worthwhile event for you, happening in downtown Toronto at the Carlton Cinema, February 22nd to 25th. Make sure to check us out. Link is in the description below for tickets and passes. Tickets will go on sale soon. Passes are already on sale. Let's get to this. Reason number 2. Well, there was that little thing that the NBA introduced, and that's the in-season tournament. And one of the things that the in-season tournament did was it allowed teams to really get a gauge of their players, their teams in high leverage competition. If you're a Raptor fan, well, clearly your team didn't take it very seriously, didn't know the rules, and basically missed out on the whole damn thing. But for the Indiana Pacers, who went all the way to the finals and ended up losing to the Los Angeles Lakers, they got a very, very good look at what tight playoff-like defenses could do to a guy like Tyrese Haliburton. Now, coming into the season, Rick Carlisle had basically, they extended Tyrese Haliburton to a designated supermax extension this past offseason. And so they have basically handed the keys over to him, and he has not disappointed. He's been incredible, but he's not a perfect player. And what the in-season tournament showed them was that they needed to get him a secondary creator. So I think the fact that they went so far in the in-season tournament, right away when you started seeing, how they were performing, even making the in-season tournament, all the, the games to get into that, and then to beat the Bucks like the way they did, I think it made the Pacers think they might be a little bit better than they actually are. And I'm not throwing any shade on the Pacers, but it clearly accelerated their thinking, but it also accelerated Tyrese Haliburton's thinking, because he immediately, there was that report of I'm ready to win now. And weirdly enough, in the weeks following that in-season tournament, the Pacers have not looked as good. They haven't looked as good. The Lakers haven't looked as good, and both teams are kind of recovering from that slumber. Obviously, Tyrese Haliburton a few weeks ago, he goes out with that really nasty injury. I think the Pacers see this as a window. They see the East as kind of wide open. Clearly, everyone is seeing the behemoths and the monsters coming up in OKC and what Victor Wembanyama is doing. And, you don't take these wide open conference races for granted. And they thought they needed to push their chips into the center of the table. Again, an injury to your star player can really make you evaluate things like, say, we don't know how long we have this guy, right? It could all be over very quickly. It happened with Derrick Rose. It's happened with Ja Morant. Certainly last year, the Grizzlies did not think this year would go the way it did. It can all end very quickly. The NBA, it's very, very fickle. And so the Pacers decided, okay, we don't want to wait. Our star's ready. They made this mistake once with Paul George, not surrounding with enough help. They lost him. He's still, a top 20 player. They had to deal him. Granted, they're very happy with what they got. They're not a big market team. They knew they had to make a trade. Everyone talking about they could just sign the guy in free agency. It wasn't going to be super easy. They decided to make the move now. I think when you consider the previous point, which was the Chad Buchanan point, and when you consider a subsequent point, which we'll talk about, which is the Rick Carlisle point, I think at some point, maybe the Raptors knew that the Pacers would also be there in free agency, that they would be able to lure him potentially in free agency. And of course, it does come down to money. And I think that is really the next talking point here. The Pacers, whether they'll ever admit it on record or not, clearly committed to Pascal Siakam's agency and to his representation, that they were willing to go all in on Siakam. Now, this is not, from what I understand and from what I've heard, this is not something that most teams were super excited to do. And what I mean by that is the Toronto Raptors reportedly had offered 3 years, to Pascal Siakam. I think there might have been some other teams that might have been willing to go 3 years plus a partial guarantee on the 4th year, maybe 3 years with a team option with a partial guarantee, or 3 years plus 4th year non-guaranteed. But there weren't a lot of teams out there that were jumping at themselves to sign a guy who hasn't been that great the past 2 years, who's approaching 30 in a few months. They weren't crazy about signing him to a 5-year, potentially team-crippling deal. The Indiana Pacers had some very unique things at play which allowed them to do this, but this seems to be one team that immediately showed the faith and said, you know what, if the Raptors won't, we will. We value you. Come here and, you'll be appreciated. Now, it's one thing to tell a guy he's appreciated, but can you show him that he is appreciated? And that's where Rick Carlisle comes in. Rick Carlisle, of course, one of my favorite coaches. He is the coach of the Indiana Pacers, and Pascal Siakam found out some months ago that Rick Carlisle was the coach that voted him in, or one of a few coaches that voted him in as an all-star last year. To those of you who don't remember, Pascal Siakam was infamously snubbed. The Raptors were not a very good team last year. He was infamously snubbed from the all-star selection, and it took an injury, and he was a write-in. So he was one of the guys who was written in. I believe James Harden was also a snub, and he basically said, I don't want to be written in. So Pascal Siakam, the coaches got the message. I believe they were leaning towards James Harden, but they eventually leaned towards Pascal Siakam. To those who don't know, coaches, all 30 coaches, make the decision on who gets voted into the All-Star game, as well as the starters. They have 25% of the vote, and for the reserves, I believe they have 100% of the vote. And Rick Carlisle apparently supported Pascal Siakam in that, and it was a very meaningful thing to Siakam. Clearly, all-star selections and all-NBA selections are very important to Pascal Siakam, so he didn't forget it. And clearly, playing for a guy who viewed you as better than James Harden last year is probably meaningful to him. We can't go into this story without mentioning Jafaar Chufani. Jafaar Chufani is Pascal Siakam's agent. He also happens to be the agent for Andrew Nembhard. He represents a bunch of players in the NBA, and these are two of them. Andrew Nembhard, for those of you who don't know, is a Canadian basketball player who plays for the Indiana Pacers. And clearly, if you want to get a read of who a guy is and make that connection, you're going to have some sort of backroom dealings and some sort of communication channels. And ultimately, if you have a player who's already a key rotation player on that team, it's going to make it a lot easier to get your client to that team. So that's pretty simple. Now, a two-parter. So this is the Myles times Myles. So this is both graphics are going to be Myles. We're going to talk about one Myles, and then we're going to talk about another Myles. Okay. So the first element of this is that Pascal Siakam throughout the years has been very, very involved in the roster building of the Toronto Raptors. The Raptors have tried their best over the last 3 years to keep Pascal involved in all sorts of discussions, including the trade for Jakob Poeltl last year, which was blessed off by Pascal Siakam. But ultimately, Pascal Siakam had made a list of players that he really wanted to play with a couple of years ago, and the top name on that list, no surprises, was Kevin Durant. The second name on that list was Myles Turner. He really believed that playing with a stretch big would really help his game. Tell me if that sounds familiar. There seems to be another guy in Toronto right now who could really, really, really use a stretch big like Myles Turner. It's not basketball science. I mean, it's really quite simple that if you want to have a straight line driver or guy who needs space, you're going to have a lot more space with the center pulled out trying to guard a guy like Myles Turner. And so far into their very early career together, Myles Turner has been doing wonders, in my opinion, for the spacing for the Indiana Pacers. And obviously, when Tyrese Haliburton comes back, I think Pascal Siakam could easily go on a heater and score 30 points per game if he really wanted to. Naturally, the pace has slowed down a lot with, Pascal Siakam. Their play style has changed a little bit with Pascal Siakam, but the vision is very clear. Myles Turner and Pascal Siakam are an ideal front court pairing. Defensively, it's not working out as well as the Pacers probably would have liked it to, but that's what you get reps for, and hopefully long term they'll make it work. I think also from understanding Myles a little bit over the years and just kind of getting a read on his personality through various interviews, he's a very, very, subdued and very down to earth and very mellow guy. And ultimately, I think that these two will get along beautifully. Then there's the Bruce Brown component of it. See, the Indiana Pacers have done some masterful work when it comes to the cap. So actually, let's start with the Myles. Let's start with the Myles Turner part of it. So last year, under the previous CBA, there was a rule that teams had to pay a certain amount of money. And if they didn't pay that money, then the money was just, I believe, subtracted from them. And basically, they had to get to what are called cap floor. So this year, that rule was changed, that you had to do it to start the season. You couldn't just get to the cap floor by the end of the season. You had to do it to the start of the season, which is why the Houston Rockets paid Dylan Brooks and Fred VanVleet crazy amounts of money because they had money to spend and nobody wanted to come. Well, the Indiana Pacers could have also done that last year, but instead of doing that, they did something really, really smart, which caught some people's eye last year, including myself. But really, I think a lot of people just kind of missed how great a move it was at the time. They basically front loaded Myles Turner's contract. I believe they paid him like 34, 35 million. They renegotiated his contract to pay him a crazy amount of money last year so that they could pay him a little bit less this year and the year following. This lesser amount of money for him means that he's paid just about as much as Jakob Poeltl is right now, even and on a descending contract, which, by the way, he's worth a lot more than Jakob Poeltl. Let's just be real. He is a top 6, top 7 center. I think most teams really value what he brings. He blocks a ton of shots. He's still relatively young. He is like a $28 million player. And for them to be able to front load his contract like that in a year where they weren't contending, that allows them to potentially max out a guy like Pascal Siakam. So again, it doesn't matter that Pascal Siakam is not worth 45 million. The point is that combined, Pascal Siakam and Myles Turner are definitely worth 65 million. So this is just really, really smart maneuvering by Chad Buchanan and Kevin Pritchard. Kevin Pritchard, I have often credited as the reason that I do anything that I do in basketball early on in my life. Was a really huge influence and, just one of the smartest, brightest basketball minds in all of in all the NBA. He's just really smart. And I thought that was a really underrated move that he made. Now on to the second underrated move that the Indiana Pacers made. Speaking of the cap floor and, spending money that you really, can't attract anybody else. The Indiana Pacers drew a lot of criticism earlier in the year when they signed Bruce Brown off of I mean, it's not that much of an overpay, but it felt like a really huge overpay, but it was a short-term deal, so nobody really thought too much of it. But yeah, honestly, it didn't really fit the Indiana Pacers. It sort of fit their play style, but 2 years and $45 nearly $1 million for Bruce Brown. But of course, when details of the deal came out, it was a team option on the second deal, fully guaranteed team option. And that convertible asset is exactly what they ended up using for Pascal Siakam. Now, of course, on the Raptors side, trading for Bruce Brown is not to keep Bruce Brown, and clearly they'd be absolute idiots to keep him. He is a very valuable player. He could potentially be dangled out for a first-round pick or 6 seconds or 4 seconds or a young player plus an expiring. Bruce Brown offers a ton of value to a contending team. Good for the Pacers to basically pull him up and say, look, this is a contract that 5 months later is going to be a huge asset for us. And honestly, if they'd given him a 4-year deal at a more conservative figure, it wouldn't be as promising an asset because it doesn't give as much flexibility. And under the new CBA, Kevin Pritchard and Chad Buchanan clearly read the tea leaves on where the CBA was going and where teams' mindsets would be. There's a ton of teams that are capped out, having expirings to relieve some of those picks, so to relieve some of those teams, or having a contract large enough that he could be the centerpiece in a trade for a guy like Pascal Siakam was a really, really smart cap maneuvering move from them. The final component of this is Rico Hines. So Pascal Siakam didn't have much of a relationship with Tyrese Haliburton. Apart from meeting at the All-Star game and maybe doing a couple of runs, they didn't really have a ton of relationship. But you know who does have a relationship with Tyrese Haliburton? This guy, Rico Hines. You know who else he has a relationship with? Pascal Siakam. So he was able to sort of just smooth it over behind the scenes and just make sure, hey, he's a good guy. He's a good guy. This is a little bit about him. So anyways, I hope that you have a renewed appreciation for just how many people it took to make this deal work for the Toronto Raptors and the Indiana Pacers. Ultimately, my grade on this deal will be, I think the Raptors won this deal clearly, but I think the Pacers also won this deal for what they want to do. I don't think this launches them into contender status, and so I'm very, very curious what they're going to do with the rest of the players on their roster. There are about 5 teams in the East that I would pick over them in a playoff series right now. For the Raptors, of course, a lot of this is going to come down to those picks. What are those picks going to be, and what are they going to get for Bruce Brown? The deal is not done until it's done, right? And so if they end up converting Bruce Brown into a first and a young player, well, then suddenly this deal looks a lot more promising than just Bruce Brown and 3 first-round picks. If it ends up being 4 first-round picks and a young player and an expiring, that's really a hell of a haul and probably closer to the haul you were looking at last summer for OG Anunoby. Obviously, all picks are not made equal, but picks are flexible, picks move. And, for the Raptors, their hope probably is that the Indiana Pacers continue to lose games. Again, as I mentioned, these are the next 10 games. They are currently a play-in team. They're clinging on, a little bit to play-in life right now. Tyrese Halliburton just coming back from his injury. And so, implementing a new guy like Siakam, it's not easy. And I'm sure by the end of the season they'll get it. But he completely disrupts how they play offensively. He helps them defensively, clearly, because he's a massive upgrade on Obi Toppin. But so far, the earliest returns on this are not looking super, super promising. For the Raptors side, clearly some people are going to point to Scottie Barnes having a bit of a dip in January. Well, that's not just due to Pascal Siakam. He's missing OG Anunoby. He's missing Jakob Poeltl. And so for the Raptors side, clearly the Raptors are also very close to the play-in. They are currently 11th or 12th in the East, 11th, I believe. And, there's teams like Brooklyn and Chicago ahead of them that could free fall very quickly. So there's right now a very small chance, but I wouldn't say that small a chance, that the Indiana Pacers and Toronto Raptors both finish in the play-in. And at that point, you'll have to just say, what's the value of having 4 extra picks for it? So again, this deal is incomplete. We'll see how it works out for the Pacers. If from the Pacers side, if this deal gets them into the second round, into a competitive series, and with one full training camp, with Tyrese Halliburton, with Jarris Walker, clearly, in my opinion, going to get much better. They're very, very, very blessed to have kept him out of that deal. I watched him play yesterday. I watched him play all year for the G League affiliated team for the Indiana Pacers. He is incredible. The fact that they were able to keep him out of that deal, the fact that they were able to keep Andrew Nembhard, Benedict Mathurin, all these players out of the deal, it's very, very intriguing. But clearly the Toronto Raptors valued cap space this offseason. Wonder why. Wink, wink, OG Anunoby. And clearly the Raptors value future picks because they, in the new CBA with, extensions going as large as they're going to be, and with Scottie Barnes, potentially being a supermax guy for the Raptors, you're going to need those very favorable late firsts, early seconds, and as many of them as you can pile up with the Raptors draft record and scouting record. I think it's a really, really good idea for the Raptors to have all of those. So that being said, let me know what you thought about this video. And let me just take a quick look at some of the comments. People are Jose, Indiana Pacers will not finish in the play-in. Okay, yeah, I think that's certainly possible. I think they could definitely finish top 6, but the top 6 of the East is not an easy. It's not an easy group to crack. Okay, if you look at the current standings, and certainly you're free to. I don't think it's the easiest group to crack. And, again, for the Toronto Raptors, this was a much needed, long overdue move. Clearly, there's some case that Scottie Barnes and Pascal Siakam can definitely play together. But, it's a clunky fit long term, not the same timeline. The Raptors reset the timeline. They fill up their draft coffers. And let's see, I think this might be a weird take, but I think they've replaced a lot of what Siakam does with RJ Barrett. Obviously not as good, clearly not as good, but maybe he gets there. He's 23 years old. And, I think they're going to get a lot more out of Grady Dick in the next 38 to 39 games to finish out the season. Who knows, what he could become, but I have a lot of optimism for what he can become. And clearly, it's not going to be super smooth sailing for Scottie Barnes. Clearly, he had a really, really rough night against the New York Knicks, 9 points, but he is going to bounce back for sure, and at that point, it's pressure and you're putting him there. And now he and his trainer are going to have a ton of footage of game tape, of analytics that are going to be able to break down exactly what he can do. One of the things that I remember talking with Brian about last year was how Scottie's role just kept changing. Like every single time when you really, really considered, like, what do you work on? Are you working on dribble handoffs? Are you working on screen setting? Are you working on post up? Are you working on the above the break stuff? See, when you're not the featured guy, you're always fitting into what somebody else wants to do. And I think that that's a really, really tough thing to train for. And I'm not saying that that's all it was, but that's a lot of what it was, right? If you really consider how to game plan to be a number one option, well, there's going to be like ball handling. There's going to be, dribble ISO stuff. There's mid post stuff. When you know what your role is on offense day to day because you're the guy, yeah, it's a lot of pressure, but it's also a much, much, much simpler thing to do. The Raptors have pushed Scottie Barnes through his first 2.5 years in Toronto into fifth option, fourth option, third option, corner spacer, above the break spacer, screener, roller, mid post guy, pinch post guy, bench leader. It's been all over the place, right? They've shifted his defensive role and all sorts of things. And I think, for the Raptors, all of this work that they've done, shifting Scottie up and down, this is very challenging for any young player. There are a lot of young players that come in, they have a very simple role: stand in the corner, shoot threes, or defend and run the floor. Scottie's role has been so complex, so diverse. He's been a second option at times, right? He's been a third option, fourth option, fifth option. He has done whatever this team has needed him to do. And it has been a great thing for the Raptors to see him as a point of attack defender. They've seen him in the lower third of the defense. They've seen him as, a guy who guards the other team's best star. They've seen him as the guy who offers help. They've seen him guard 1 through 5. They've seen him play 1 through 5 on offense. Really, I think if there was an award for the most versatile player in the NBA, Scottie Barnes would win it going away in a landslide. So for the Toronto Raptors, they have a really good gauge on what Scottie is as a player at this point, because they've put him into hundreds of different situations across, all 82 teams, all across against all 29 teams in the NBA. So they've seen him in various matchups. They have all this data, and believe me, the Raptors are really huge on data. So anyways, Pascal Siakam, best of luck in Indiana. Clearly not super rooting for you, because I am rooting for the Raptors to get a lottery pick. But it would be so poetic, so interesting if the Raptors do end up meeting the Indiana Pacers in the play-in, because I definitely think that the Raptors have an easier schedule than the Pacers. The Raptors, according to Tankathon, strength of schedule, have the 25th hardest schedule from this point on. That is very interesting, given that they are a pretty bad team. And they don't get to face themselves, and they are easily one of the worst teams that other teams are facing right now, per the Tankathon stats. It's really interesting that they have an easier schedule than most teams. Now, clearly, strength of schedule can be shit. You face teams at the wrong time. You face good teams when they're healthy versus unhealthy. But clearly, down the stretch of the season, there are going to be a lot of teams that are going to be resting. If the Raptors are still pushing for the play-in, if the Raptors really decide right now, we are going to win 37 games and make that 10th seed or whatever, I think they should do it. I really do. I don't think that there's much value in tanking at this point. The teams beneath them are pretty bad. A win tonight against Memphis, which is hapless and playing without Desmond Bane, without Ja Morant, it's going to be really difficult for the Raptors to be bad enough to do this. Anyways, make sure to hit like on this video. I would really appreciate it. Subscribe. We're super, super, super close to 8,000 subscribers. We've grown 1,000 subscribers in the last 20 days. Yeah. Talk to you later, guys. Bye.